Hello and welcome to MEE Live. I'm Tamara Hemani and today is Thursday, May 7th. We're asking, is Israel about to restart its war on Gaza? 7 months in, what has happened to the Gaza ceasefire plan? Will it ever progress to phase 2? Or will Israel return to full-fledged war in the Strip? After the body of the last Israeli captive was recovered in January of this year, Israel was expected to allow the entry of a technocratic committee to govern Gaza and an international stabilisation force to keep peace in the Strip, while supplying temporary homes and aid for displaced Palestinians. But instead, Israel's military has continued to operate inside the Strip, killing nearly 800 Palestinians since the start of the ceasefire in October of last year. It has also entrenched its presence along the Yellow Line, expanding its zone of control westward to now cover roughly 60% of Gaza's territory. Israel's army has built a string of outposts along the line, demolishing remaining buildings and shooting Palestinians walking nearby. Talks about the ceasefire's next stage have stalled over the issue of Hamas's weapons.
It's very low.
The group has demanded that Israel comply with phase 1 of the plan and provide more concrete guarantees that the war will not resume, as well as a clear pathway to a Palestinian state. Yet Israel's government has insisted that the group return not just offensive weapons, but even light arms like rifles, which would be a protracted process with no clear end goal. The Board of Peace has shifted its full weight behind Israel, saying that if Hamas does not agree to its disarmament plan, it will not hold Israel to the terms of the ceasefire, which it acknowledges that it has already partly violated. So, is Israel set to resume its war on Gaza with U.S. backing? To find out, I'm speaking to Palestinian analyst Mouin Rabbani about the stalled ceasefire talks, before asking Israeli pollster Dahlia Scheindlin about the support inside Israel for a return to war. Firstly, though, Mouin. Hi, Mouin. Thank you so much for speaking to Middle East Eye today. Hi, Mouin. Thank you so much for speaking to Middle East Eye today.
Hi, it's good to be with you.
So we're now 7 months into this truce, into Trump's plan for Gaza. Has very much changed on the ground inside the Strip? Are the Palestinians in Gaza feeling any benefits?
Excuse me. Well, we're now 7 months into a ceasefire agreement without a ceasefire. As you've noted, almost 800 Palestinians have been killed and thousands injured in daily attacks on the Gaza Strip, the majority of them civilians. And one could argue that the intensive phase of the genocide, with dozens or 100 or more people killed every day, is suspended or perhaps even over. But the siege continues, the humanitarian crisis continues. Growing number of people are dying as a result of, let's say, indirect causes rather than direct violence. So things have changed, but not necessarily improved.
As you mentioned, there's this humanitarian crisis. We're in kind of a slow phase. As you mentioned, a lot of people dying of indirect causes, even if not direct warfare. Why is that? Because we completed phase 1 with the return of captives and of Palestinian prisoners. There was meant to be a lot of humanitarian aid, temporary homes, reconstruction, new governance. Why has that process not started? What's holding it up?
Well, the short answer is that Israel has failed, or rather refused, to meet any of its commitments under the October 8th agreement that it concluded with Hamas. And more importantly, the custodian of this agreement, the United States and the Board of Peace, as it calls itself, has done absolutely nothing to compel Israel to respect its commitments. More to the point, they are now putting additional demands on the Palestinians to begin implementing commitments that the Palestinians have never accepted, even as they make absolutely no effort to ensure that Israel meets those obligations that it has already itself accepted.
I want to ask you about those demands. As you mentioned, the Board of Peace has hardened its stance, coming pretty firmly behind Israel, saying that unless Hamas agrees to this disarmament, Israel won't need to meet the commitments of the ceasefire. These demands are quite maximalist, full disarmament, including light defensive weapons. I mean, do these sound like realistic demands to you? What is the thought process here? Is this, could this be just kind of a pretext for a return to war? What is behind the hardening of this stance, and is it in good faith?
Well, when of course there's never good faith involved in these issues, but we're now in a situation where the United States is and Israel are effectively telling the Palestinians that unless they meet obligations specified in the second phase of an agreement, obligations to be sure that Hamas has not yet accepted, then Israel will be under no obligation to implement commitments that it already accepted last October for the first phase of this agreement. And this is patently absurd. And it fits into a broader pattern of Israel always demanding that its adversaries and its enemies be disarmed so that it can attack them at will. I mean, there is absolutely no indication that if Palestinians would disarm, that Israel's attacks and territorial expansion and so on would cease. I mean, just look at what's happening in the West Bank, look at what's happening in Lebanon and Syria and so on. But no, this is a completely unrealistic plan. I mean, bear in mind, the Board of Peace itself established an alternative administrative body for the Gaza Strip months ago. And to this day, not a single member of this, what's it called, the National Committee for the Administration of the Gaza Strip, not a single member of that committee has been able to enter the Gaza Strip because Israel has refused to provide permission for it to do so. And much more importantly, in my view, the Americans in the Board of Peace have exercised precisely zero pressure on Israel to compel it to do so. And that tells you, I think, all you need to know about how the rest of this process would unfold if it in fact continues. Now, if I could just get back to your question, yes, there is a lot of speculation that Israel would like to resume its genocidal military campaign against the Gaza Strip in full force, particularly as it encounters significant obstacles, and in some cases even a U.S. veto with regards to Iran and Lebanon. So I would absolutely not exclude that prospect.
I wonder then, what is the end goal here, if there is a concrete end goal of which to speak? They're not allowing any alternative body into the Strip. There are these maximalist demands which they know would be tantamount to surrender for Hamas. How do they plan to resolve this issue in the Strip? Do they plan to resolve it?
Well, when you ask how they plan to resolve it, I think we first have to determine what the objectives are. And the objectives, I think, are quite clear. They've, in fact, been around since at least the 1950s and have been publicly and explicitly enunciated on multiple occasions since October 2023. And that is to force the Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip. In practice, the forced expulsions to Egypt failed in 2023 and 24 and 25. And it's quite clear that the agenda now is to make the Gaza Strip unfit for human habitation so that you get a situation largely akin to that which you had, let's say, in Syria in the past decade, where people are not necessarily put onto trucks and buses and shipped abroad, but come to the conclusion that the conditions of life have become so untenable that they begin leaving as individuals, as families, as small groups, and so on. And it bears recollection that the Israeli government has recently appointed a dual U.S. Israeli citizen, a fanatic right wing journalist by the name of Caroline Glick, who is responsible for seeking seeking out countries abroad that would be willing to accept Palestinians that Israel hopes to export from their homeland. This has passed largely without comment, certainly not by the Board of Peace, because apparently ethnic cleansing is considered the most natural order of things when it is Israel that is doing it.
So from your reading, this whole plan under the cover of some kind of ceasefire and transition in Gaza has really just seen Israel switch to pursuing its aims in kind of a lower gear, or a more discreet gear rather, and the aims that as you said it set out on this war in Gaza with, which is to create enough pressure and harshness of conditions to force Palestinians in Gaza to reconsider their future there, something that would amount to ethnic cleansing.
Well, if I can paraphrase von Clausewitz, the Board of Peace is a pursuit of genocide by other means.
I suppose I want to close then by asking you how Palestinians in Gaza themselves are seeing this moment. They've had, reconstruction and even kind of temporary housing and aid hinging on political goals. And so that's been blocked for them. At the same time, asking Hamas to lay down every last rifle would be, tantamount to surrender. In the words of one Hamas official, if they did so, Israel could decide tomorrow to basically take over the rest of the strip. How are Palestinians in Gaza feeling caught between kind of wanting to resume a normal life, but seeing no clear path there? Because I imagine it must be very difficult, that dilemma.
Well, Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are indisputably in a very desperate situation, and I think, for the most part, are very much focused on the challenges of daily survival. I mean, we now have rodent swarms, insect swarms throughout the Gaza Strip. There's a dearth of food, medicine, medical facilities, and so on. And so people, I think, are very much focused on daily survival. I mean, it's a stain on humanity and on the international system that 3 years into a genocide, we're even still discussing these issues. And I think for the most part, let's say ordinary civilians in the Gaza Strip aren't particularly engaged with these longer term issues. Having said that, I think for the most part, they do understand, and this is, I think, an important contrast with Syria, which we were discussing earlier. For the most part, they do understand that if they leave, it's a one-way ticket, it's permanent exile, because they will not have the opportunity to return to their homeland once conditions improve, certainly not so long as Israel is in charge.
Just on that point, while you mentioned that dilemma and not being really able to think about these long-term issues, while there is this moment of desperation, in many senses economically, chaos, and a focus on survival, do these alternative bodies, even if they are allowed to enter the strip, like this technocratic committee and so on, do they have any real credibility or legitimacy? Because I suppose after all the chaos with the war and the desperation, it is groups on the ground like Hamas who are, if they are able to enforce some semblance of law and order, even if they do not agree with them politically, you know what, these are the guys on the ground installing some sense of order. And that is preferable to, a return to the chaos of war or whatever body Israel might attempt to install. Is that the rationale there?
Well, if you're asking specifically about this administrative committee that was set up under the Board of Peace, it was established, I think, with the implicit consent of Hamas and the approval of the Palestinian Authority, and was seen as kind of a surrogate Palestinian administration, even though it was established and appointed by foreign powers without any Palestinian involvement or even consultation. The problem now for it is that its credibility is being systematically dismantled to the point of disintegration by those who established it. I mean, if it can't even pay a short visit to the territory it's supposed to be administering, and those who appointed it do absolutely nothing to ensure that it can. What more could you do to undermine its credibility and to send a very clear message that this is basically a useless body?
And in parallel to that committee, obviously the much vaunted International Stabilisation Force, which was meant to be a multinational peacekeeping force of volunteer countries, that also seems quite distant from actually gaining any hold in the Strip. Do you see that coming to fruition anytime soon? Or do you believe that's
No, I
also...
think it's dead in the water. No, I think it's dead in the water. And in fact, the main contributor to that force, which was supposed to be Indonesia, providing something on the order of 8,000 troops, withdrew its participation or its intention to participate, I believe, at the outset of the US-Israeli war against Iran. But even apart from that, no country is going to send thousands of troops into the Gaza Strip absent a reliable and credible and legitimate political arrangement and operational arrangements for such a deployment. And once again, Israel and its handmaiden, the Board of Peace, have absolutely refused to provide any assurances in that respect. And they're basically, it's quite similar to what we're seeing in Lebanon, where Israel has been unable to defeat Hezbollah. And so it's, in a sense, subcontracting that to the Lebanese government. Here, what Israel would like to do, after 2 years plus of genocide, it has been unable to defeat Hamas, so it would like this international stabilization force to defeat and disarm it on its behalf. And the countries that would be involved in this, of course, say, no, we're going there. It's called an international stabilization force, not, not the Israeli militia in the Gaza Strip. And so in that sense, I think with Israel absolutely refusing to make any political concessions regarding the mandate of this group, and the Board of Peace refusing to exercise any pressure on Israel in this respect, it's essentially dead in the water. And bear in mind also that in the last week, Reuters reported that the US is planning to dismantle this, what was called the Civil Military Coordination Committee, an office established in southern Israel that was supposed to oversee the implementation of this agreement. Now, if that report is also correct, I think it's entirely plausible that we could see the resumption of the genocidal military campaign in the coming weeks.
Yeah, what strikes me about so many of these issues is much of the international community's fears seem to have come to fruition, where there was an opening bout of pressure and all these grand plans by Trump, and unfortunately that has gradually given way as the president's mind has drifted elsewhere to kind of Israel asserting its control and its vision for the Strip's future, rather than meeting consistent external pressure to reach some kind of an agreement. I don't know if that would be your reading too.
I think that's a largely correct interpretation, yes.
Mouin Rabbani, thank you so much for speaking to Middle East Eye today. It's been a real pleasure to hear your analysis, and hopefully we'll be speaking to you again soon.
Thank you.
As the ceasefire talks stall and Hamas retains control over half of Gaza, senior Israeli military officials are reportedly recommending a return to war, arguing that the best time to defeat Hamas is now. In preparation, Israel's military has apparently transferred brigades from southern Lebanon to Gaza, increased its airstrikes over the Strip, and pushed its yellow line westward, waiting for the green light from Israel's government to act. So, could Israel's military wage another war on the Strip? And does it have public support in doing so? To find out, I'm speaking to Israeli pollster, journalist, and analyst Dahlia Scheindlin. Dahlia, thank you so much for speaking to MEE Live today. I want to begin by asking you about these reports that Israel's military is saying now is the best time to defeat Hamas and advocating a return to war in Gaza. What is pushing this renewed drive? Do you see it as inevitable?
I don't know if there's a particular issue with relation to the timing, possibly because there is still a pause with Iran and something like a ceasefire with Lebanon, with Hezbollah in Lebanon, although that looks even more precarious now due to the assassination last night. But it could be simply that there is a little more room for maneuver. But I think that Israelis and the government and the army have always realized that Hamas was not destroyed, was not eliminated, was not completely neutralized, and that the aim of that front, like so many other fronts, has not been achieved. And so there was always an expectation that there would be a renewed fighting at some point. I think that, Israelis in general were very relieved when the ceasefire took hold, but primarily because of the hostages being released back in, last October. I don't think anybody really believed it was going to hold for very long. And that's, it was only a matter of time until the fighting started there again, until the IDF, under the government's direction, would try to go back and complete the job, even though it's becoming increasingly clear that it's not necessarily a job that can be completed.
I want to ask you about that, about completing the job. There is the sense, as you mentioned, that now that there are no more captives in Gaza, Israel's military can act in a more unrestrained fashion and, close that gap between what Netanyahu promised and what he was actually able to deliver in Gaza. What does finishing the job look like? It's a term we've heard in Gaza, but also to some extent in Iran and Lebanon. What does that actually mean to Israelis?
I think what Israelis mean is that there will be, that the military...
Dahlia's frozen.
For Israelis, when it comes
Sorry,
to Hamas,
Dahlia, I just lost you briefly there about what it would mean for Israelis finishing the job.
Yes, what I was saying is that from the Israeli perspective, there's never really, the idea is basically that the military threat of Hamas, Hezbollah, or Iran, which is of course beyond just a military threat, but also a strategic threat, would be neutralized. However, it's never really been spelled out for Israelis exactly what that means in the case of Hamas in particular. Does it mean that every single person who was ever affiliated with Hamas is dead? Does it mean that anybody related to their families is dead? That's certainly what it felt like Israelis thought, and the government was advocating in the very beginning after October 7th. It felt like that. It seemed like Israel was behaving like that. Or does it mean somehow, reaching a stage where Hamas, is prepared to disarm, for example, decommission its arms, which is supposed to be part of the 21-point plan of the original ceasefire? That looks increasingly unlikely now because Hamas is saying until Israel commits to withdrawing its troops from more than half of the territory in Gaza where they are installed, that it won't do that. And so maybe that particular aspect of finishing the job whereby Hamas by agreement disarms is impossible. What else can it mean? Does it mean that Hamas doesn't, never participates in Palestinian politics? All of these angles have really never been clarified for the Israeli public. And I think because the government doesn't have a very sophisticated view of it themselves, they plan to essentially, it seems like they plan to simply continue with rounds of fighting, always under the pretense of neutralizing or finishing the job of destroying Hamas, but without any real benchmarks about what that means. During the war, we saw, counts of the numbers of Hamas members and particularly militants who had been killed and, talk about destroying Hamas's battalions, but that's all done. That's all over. So there's no more, it's hard to think of military measures at this point, and I think it's not sufficiently defined, at least for the Israeli public, what are the actual benchmarks that will determine that Hamas has been finished, so to speak.
Yeah, I wonder, as you mentioned, there doesn't seem to really be a sophisticated view of what that would look like. And as you yourself have noted, there seems to be a recurring pattern of dissatisfaction with military action, and yet that being really the only path forward. So is there really a vision for Gaza and for other neighboring territories other than, well, after October 7th, we will just have to maintain a permanent physical presence in these areas, and there's actually no other way to ensure security beyond this kind of indefinite occupation?
One thing to keep in mind is that for certain ministers in this government, including ministers from the ruling Likud party and including their coalition partners, the right-wing messianic, ultra-nationalist extremist parties, many of them have a vision, an ideological vision of conquering Gaza and permanently annexing Gaza and rebuilding settlements there. And this is the thing kind of thing they talk about fairly openly amongst themselves, not privately. They've held conferences on this kind of vision. I can't say it's been formally announced as government policy, but the government also can't deny the fact that so many of its members and actual ministers are saying that kind of thing. So that's one answer that various figures within the government would give. From the security and military establishment, I think most of the higher military brass believes that it's not a good idea for Israel to permanently occupy Gaza because they see that as a security liability, although there has been at times a kind of thematic idea that the army can control security without controlling civilian life, a sort of, I think, personally, I think a false separation between controlling security in Gaza, which many Israelis, including supposedly the more moderate camps, will say Israel must continue to control Gaza at the security and military level without necessarily controlling civilian life. But I think those two are fundamentally inseparable. I mean, the whole premise of the seizure of the siege or closure of Gaza from 2007 onwards, most affected civilians most of all. It affected civilian life apparently more than anything else, because the idea of the closure was, in order supposedly to advance security, that Israel would keep control over everything going in and out of Gaza under very, very strict watch, strict restrictions, generally hidden lists that human rights groups had to kind of sue the government to get them to try to reveal what was on those lists of restricted items. Very, very restrictive terms for people going in and out of Gaza. All of that was supposed to maintain security. And in the end, it had a profound effect on civilian life, but did not sufficiently protect Israeli security, as we now know. So I think that is the one thing you can say that some of, in the security establishment or in the, again, sort of more political leadership, including the opposition, who try to portray themselves as more moderate than the current government, will still never give an inch in terms of anything like advancing political, solutions for Gaza and the West Bank or Palestinians as a whole. They will continue to say that Israel needs to maintain security control over Gaza, but at least they limit it to security purposes, even if it's a false separation. Whereas the government, as I mentioned, has these very, very, outspoken ideological commitments to staying in Gaza and controlling it, from what they say, forever.
Interesting. You see that regardless of who wins elections in October, that belief in that false separation will endure. I want to ask you about that because under this pretext of security, Palestinians in Gaza have continued to live in dire conditions. No temporary homes, no reconstruction, insufficient aid. Surely those conditions will only set Israel back politically in its aims in Gaza, in terms of, we know that Hamas has continued to assert its authority. We know that it's one source of leverage, or, among Palestinians in Gaza, its kind of redeeming quality, as it were, is its ability to install law and order after 2.5 years of chaos. Do you see this kind of illusion of separation between security and civilian as actually backfiring on Israel further? You've noted before kind of this damage of believing that weak states or weak territories are preferable to Israel. Do you think this illusion could prove more dangerous than perhaps any of Israel's political establishment realizes?
It's hard to imagine anything more dangerous than what already happened. In other words, we know exactly how dangerous it can be. We don't have to guess. And in terms of, what I proposed in the analysis about weak states is that, I don't think there is necessarily a clear overriding, iron law that Israel prefers weak states. I think it is to some extent on a case-by-case basis. But I think what Israel definitely prefers in the case of the Palestinians is to avoid a Palestinian state. That is something that the right wing absolutely is committed to. And by right wing here, I include right wing parties that are not part of the current coalition. So if there is a change of government in the elections that are supposed to be held by the end of October of this year, either the current government and the current coalition will win another victory, or the opposition will win, and the leading parties in the opposition are currently taking positions that can pretty, safely be categorized as sort of militant nationalist right wing, but not as infused with religious ideology. And under that approach, it's likely that they will share the commitment that whether they, whatever they actually plan for Gaza is, a feature, really a means to make sure that they avoid an independent Palestinian state. Now, it could be that over time, years ahead, even a government like that may eventually be pressured by circumstances to begin some process of leading in the direction of Palestinian independence, but it's very, very hard to imagine. It feels pretty hypothetical now. You can imagine the circumstances that would lead to that. I can even imagine a pathway, but it seems, so remote right now as to be very unlikely, no matter what the electoral outcome.
Yeah, as you mentioned, much of the issue with the Israel's opposition that they take with Netanyahu is, taking issue with how well Israel has fought its wars rather than, with belief in the use of military force itself. So it seems we're still quite a distance from that. At the same time, I'm sure you saw the poll by Khan showing that, between 11 to 17% of Israelis thought that Israel had won on any of its various fronts in the region since October 7th. Really dismal numbers, given the devastation that these past couple of years have seen. Is there a point at which they begin to believe that these wars are no longer yielding the gains that they'd hoped? Or are we still very far away from this point? And will Israelis continue to sit inside that maybe comfortable illusion that actually if we press a bit harder, if we fight a bit longer, without restraints this time, we can get to that end goal?
I think there's also contradictory information because there are other polls now showing that Israelis, definitely think the Israel Democracy Institute poll, for example, that was published just a couple of days ago, that Israelis think that what we call, diplomatic approaches must also be used alongside or after the military approach. And it is also very common to hear from, senior military analysts and senior political figures that all battlefield gains and operational military victories or achievements must be followed up or must be leveraged or parlayed into diplomatic achievements in order to really gain longer term security for Israel. So I don't think that's such a radical concept right now. I don't think it's all, I wouldn't necessarily call it a comfortable illusion for Israelis. I think they are being sort of, fed very little by way of alternatives right now from their leadership. And I mean the elected leadership, I mean the current government of Israel, and most of the opposition, as I noted, is falling into line. I don't think Israelis are happy about that situation. If you look again at indicators from the most recent Israel Democracy Institute survey, when they asked about all areas of life, there's not a single area of the four things that they test: security, future of democracy, future of security, future of democracy, future of the economy, and future of social solidarity. Not a single one shows a majority who are optimistic. So I don't think it's a very good time. I don't think it's a comfortable illusion, but I think there's a bit of a paradox by which Israelis don't think there is any alternative right now other than continued military approaches to finish what the current military operations and wars have not been able to accomplish, even being aware that they have failed to accomplish that. And yet at the very same time, when asked theoretically, do you think that diplomacy should then follow up and play a part, the majority agree with that too. It's just that there are no political leaders moving in that direction per se. We may see that change if something were to come of the diplomatic process between Israel and the state of Lebanon right now. I think it's one of the only things that Israel, under pressure from the American administration, the Israeli leadership has been forced to sort of get behind it and try to explain to the public that this is a very good thing and it might help. But we know that the majority of the public is pessimistic that it will actually bear fruit for now.
And I'm interested, you mentioned kind of like a lack of alternatives being presented by Israel's political leadership. As we know, when Israel has been forced to engage in diplomacy, it has come under serious pressure from the U.S. Unfortunately, that the current U.S. administration lacks when it comes to consistency. We've seen that in Gaza. We've seen that elsewhere. Is that kind of your only, I don't want to say hope because it sounds a bit optimistic, but your only belief that, Israel could engage in diplomacy with U.S. pressure? And do you think that that pressure could stick in Lebanon, in Iran, and in Gaza? Because we've seen kind of the U.S. taking its foot off the pedal with the Gaza ceasefire talks. Do you believe that that pressure could be sustained? Because I guess the alternative, which is ongoing war, given the strain placed on Israel's military reservists, also isn't sustainable.
Meaning, do I think that Israel would advance negotiations on its own without American pressure? Not under this government per se. I don't think so. And will the American administration keep up its pressure? It really all depends on the concentration span of President Trump. I think that he is, as we are seeing, I think he is losing patience for the war with Iran. He seems to be trying to create facts on the ground that there is an agreement with Iran just about to be, to be agreed, and it's underway and it's already happening. The Iranians don't seem quite so sure. But I think he's conveying that because it probably reflects how he himself has lost patience for the war. Now, if he loses patience or concentration, those are two different things. Losing patience with Israel's, multi-front wars could mean that he would keep the pressure up. Losing concentration could mean that he moves on to other issues and lets Israel do what it wants. It's very hard to predict.
Yeah, I suppose that's the irony, that Netanyahu's credentials were previously the fact that he was Mr. Security and had a good relationship with America, specifically Mr. Trump. Do you see both of those qualities now coming under growing criticism? Maybe going into October's elections, he could even lose those two attributes as selling points.
Well, I think those who are opposed to him now already believe that the Mr. Security idea has been shattered. They cannot understand why anybody would support him after October 7th, whereas his supporters will say, but the fact that October 7th happened is proof that you need someone like Netanyahu to continue being tough. It's just a completely different worldview. And I should say that this polarization runs so deep that the people who support Netanyahu are still running at around 40% of Israeli society, not a small minority. And they are very, very committed. They've barely changed. That bloc really doesn't change its mind over pretty much anything. So on that issue, I think you will still see people sticking to their positions. Again, the majority think that he has been a disaster for security because of the failures, but those who support him say, really the roundabout argument that the security breaches prove why we need someone like Netanyahu. In terms of being close to America, I think that most will agree that he is still, fairly close with President Trump, and the two seem, and Netanyahu says every day, including, just probably last night, I speak to Trump all the time, and we have a great relationship, and our coordination is wonderful. I don't think people doubt that their relationship is good, but I do think that the fact that Trump advanced the ceasefire with Iran and basically forced Israel into a ceasefire with Hezbollah in Lebanon, I do think was something that Israelis were not at all happy about. I was surprised myself at how what such strong majorities in polls opposed both of those ceasefires, and that the really precipitous drop in the number in the percentage of Israelis who believe that Trump takes Israel's security considerations into account in his own decision making. So while Israelis believe that they are very close, it's worth questioning whether that is an advantage or a liability or simply another neutral factor, considering how completely committed the pro and anti-Netanyahu sides are to their position on him.
I wondered then, to salvage that image of toughness and Mr. Security, given so much of this is about optics and having achievements to show, do you see Netanyahu and whatever successive government follows then kind of making its presence in southern Lebanon, Gaza, obviously its additional buffer zone in Syria, kind of more indefinite, to show at least we've pushed our enemies backward, at least we've gotten something after these years?
You mean after elections, if they win?
Regardless of who wins in elections.
I think it's a tough call. I really think it's going to be a matter of, Netanyahu's coalition, for one thing, because again, if he has very, very extreme ideologues in the coalition, they will want to stay in southern Lebanon because, frankly, they want to expand Israel's sovereignty into southern Lebanon. They have said so. Netanyahu himself, I'm not even sure if he has a strong feeling about it. I think that at this point, he is really just locking himself into what he needs to do. He's not trapped, but he will go along and convince himself that whatever his coalition partners who keep him in power want is the right thing. I don't know if, for security purposes, if there's any, consensus within the security establishment that Israel should remain permanently in southern Lebanon. I mean, Israelis have very bad memories of the 18-year occupation between 1982 and the year 2000, when it kind of, was a slow bleed. And it was, of course, terrible for the people living in Lebanon. But Israelis have no fond memories of that either. So I don't think they have a great appetite for completely, indefinite, ongoing occupation of southern Lebanon. But a political, messianic, fundamentalist government is capable of doing that. And in terms of Syria, I think that there's more room for maneuver because, it just isn't quite as sensitive for the different, militant actors who are at play in Lebanon. And I think that there's maybe a little bit more room for maneuver. Israel's also not as deeply embedded in such a swath of territory as it plans to be or could be in southern Lebanon. And I think, again, the final frontier is going to be Palestinian areas. I think that Israel, under any government, is not considering any sort of withdrawal from Palestinian territories unless very heavily pressured to do so by a confluence of factors, probably largely from the outside.
A very bleak outlook for what comes ahead, but very insightful as well. Dahlia, thank you so much for speaking to MEE Live today.
Thank you.
And for everyone watching, thank you for tuning in. Make sure you're following us on social media at Middle East Eye. You can email meelive@middleeasteye.net. Hit subscribe to stay on top of all of our coverage.